They said her sister died in the fire, but 20 years later, someone left a letter in her mailbox. No name, no return address, just 7 words. She's not dead. Look in the well. What she uncovered in Crosslake Hollow was never supposed to be found. Before we start, please subscribe. The morning fog clung to the gravel road like a memory refusing to lift. Pastor Winslow stepped out of the rental car, her boots crunching the dew-slicked earth. Before her stood the skeletal remains of the old Winslow house. Not much more than stone foundations, charred timber, and the stubborn bones of a chimney. The house had stood on this land for 3 generations until the night it didn't. She hadn't been back to Crosslake Hollow in 19 years. Not since the fire. Not since they buried an empty casket beside her mother's. The scent of damp earth and pine wrapped around her, sharper than she remembered. And for a moment, she hesitated. One hand rested on the roof of the car, grounding her. She could still hear her father's voice, not as it had been in life, but the echo preserved in cassette tapes and fading Sunday sermons. Even silence speaks if you sit with it long enough, he'd once told his congregation. And now she was back, listening for what hadn't been said. The hollow hadn't changed much. Crosslake's only gas station still bore the faded red Texaco sign. The general store's porch sagged like tired shoulders, its wood groaning under decades of gossip and rain. She'd passed them both on the drive in, and even now, she imagined heads had turned to watch her car roll past. Her return was no secret. In towns like this, secrets never stayed hidden, unless someone worked very hard to keep them that way. A light breeze stirred the ash-colored grass. Birds fluttered through the trees lining the property, their morning songs eerily soft. Mara reached for the folder tucked under her arm and pulled out the property deed. It was a copy, the original likely lost in the county courthouse flood years ago. Still, it granted her the right to stand here again, to sort through what had been left behind when her father perished in the fire. At least, that's what the town had always said. She crossed the yard slowly, her boots brushing against wild sage and forgotten clover. The outline of the house was still visible in the earth. Charred beams lay half sunken into the soil, and the hearth, surprisingly intact, rose from the rubble like a tombstone. This was where it had started, or ended. Mara crouched near the foundation, running her fingers along the brickwork. The texture was familiar. When she was 10, she'd helped her father remortar that very wall, smearing cement across the seams with trembling fingers and laughing when she got it on her shoes. Now her hands moved more carefully. She wasn't here to rebuild. She was here because of the letter. It had arrived 2 months ago. No return address, just her name written in ink so faint it was nearly dust. Inside was a page torn from a church hymnal, Psalm 77 circled in pencil, and a photo. The photo showed the corner of a room, a familiar one. The carved wooden trim was unmistakable, as was the faded red floral wallpaper her mother had chosen years before. But what made her breath catch was the object in the corner of the photo. A rocking chair, scorched down one side, yet still standing. It had belonged to her sister, Elise, who had never been officially found in the fire. Her name had never been carved into a headstone. Her name was never spoken after that night, and yet the photo had been taken recently. That chair had burned, but someone had found it again. Mara stood slowly, her knees stiff with the weight of the past. She walked around what had once been the living room, her feet kicking aside shards of blackened wood and broken glass. The air was thick with dampness and the quiet that pressed in from the forest. Then she heard it, a hollow creak beneath her right foot. She froze. Carefully, she stepped back and knelt. Beneath the collapsed remains of the floor, hidden under years of rot and soil, was a space, just wide enough to fit a person. A cellar? No one had ever mentioned a cellar in the reports. Her heart pounded as she brushed away debris, uncovering a latch. Rusted, bent, but real. She tugged at it, once, twice, until finally it gave with a reluctant groan. A stale gust of air drifted up from below, cool and dry, untouched by sun or time. Mara reached for the flashlight she'd brought, clicked it on, and pointed it downward. Stairs descended into darkness. She hesitated, then stepped down into the unknown. The air changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It smelled not of fire, but of stone and age, a stillness preserved in layers. Her flashlight beam cut across the room. Old shelves, broken jars, a trunk covered in dust. Then it landed on something that stopped her breath. A child's dress, pale blue, folded carefully on a stool in the corner, as if someone had just left it there yesterday. Mara stepped forward, her hands trembling. Her sister had owned a dress just like this. Number, she corrected herself silently. That dress burned in the fire. Except this one hadn't. She reached for it, but before her fingers could close around the fabric, her light caught something else. Writing on the wall. Scratched into the stone in uneven letters. Elise was here. Her knees nearly gave out. She emerged from the cellar an hour later, blinking against the daylight, her clothes streaked with dirt and her mind spinning. The dress was real. The writing was real. And someone had been down there, not years ago, but recently. There were new footprints in the dust, smudges that couldn't have survived more than a week in this humidity. Someone else knew. Someone had kept it hidden, and someone had waited for her to find it. As Mara stood in the ruined skeleton of her childhood home, the breeze shifted. It carried the scent of pine and something older, something like candle wax and sorrow. She turned slowly. On the crumbling hearthstone sat an envelope. It hadn't been there when she arrived. The envelope was ivory, the kind used for weddings or eulogies. Weighty, thick, and sealed with red wax pressed into the shape of a cross. Not a modern print or sticker, but something pressed by hand. The impression was imperfect, the cross slightly askew. Mara stared at it, heart thudding so loudly she was sure the birds had gone quiet to listen. She stepped forward and picked it up, turning it over in her hand. Her name was written across the front in that same pale ink. Mara Winslow. No title, no address, no explanation. She didn't open it right away. She looked around first. The trees swayed gently. A crow cawed once from the high branches, but no other presence stirred. Whoever had left it was gone. The envelope trembled slightly in her grip as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of aged paper. The writing was cramped, hurried. You're not wrong to come back. She never left. They all lied. The fire was never meant for him. It was meant for her. Mara read the words twice, then again. She never left. Who? They all lied. Who were they? She sat slowly on a broken stone slab near the hearth, her body refusing to move any farther. Her mind scrambled for context. Elise? But how could that be? She folded the letter with care, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat. Her sister had been 8 when the fire consumed the house. Elise had a favorite pink raincoat and a doll named Charlotte with one glass eye. She liked humming lullabies with no words and slipping notes under Mara's bedroom door with scribbled drawings of angels and stars. Mara had carried those notes in her Bible long after the fire, but they never found Elise's body. Only the remains of the house, her father's burned pulpit, and enough rubble to bury every memory in dust and doubt. So why did this envelope feel like Elise had written it just yesterday? She returned to town by dusk, the car wheels crunching over familiar gravel roads and autumn leaves curled crisp on the shoulders. Crosslake Hollow was a town stitched together by silence. When you were a child, it felt quaint. When you were grown, it felt like a trap. The Parsons Inn still sat across from the chapel, its porch sagging, paint flaking in strips. It had once been a rectory before the war, now converted to 3 small guest rooms for the occasional visitor. She parked and carried her bag up the creaking steps. The old bell above the door jingled faintly as she entered. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a loose braid and an air of quiet authority. "Evening," the woman said without looking up. "You must be Mara Winslow." Mara stiffened. "You've got your mother's jaw. I remember her." The woman glanced up and offered a polite, unreadable smile. "I'm Bernice. I run the place. Room's ready." She slid a brass key across the counter, its tag labeled Room 2. Mara accepted it without argument. "Thank you. I put extra blankets in the chest. Nights get cold early around here. Breakfast is at 7 if you want it." "I'll be up." Bernice hesitated before adding, "People may act like they've forgotten what happened, but they haven't." "I don't expect them to," Mara replied quietly. "No," Bernice said, softer now. "I don't suppose you do." Room 2 was small but clean. A lace curtain swayed at the window. The bedspread smelled faintly of lavender and age. The Bible on the nightstand was well thumbed, a pressed flower tucked between the Psalms. Mara set the envelope on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed. She thought of the cellar, the dress, the handwriting on the wall. Then she thought of the townspeople. Everyone had attended the memorial back then. The chapel was packed wall to wall, but only a handful had offered condolences when Mara left town. The rest, her father's congregation, her teachers, her neighbors, all kept their distance, like the fire had singed her too. Like grief was something you could catch. She hadn't heard from anyone in 19 years. Not until that envelope arrived. The next morning, Mara woke before the sun. The dream still clung to her. Elise, small and barefoot, standing in the woods behind the house, humming softly. But when Mara tried to speak, her sister vanished like smoke. She dressed quickly and headed to the Crosslake Chapel, a red brick building with stained glass windows that glowed even in overcast light. The sign out front still read, Pastor Matthew Winslow, Senior Minister, though he had been gone for nearly 2 decades. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and old paper. The pews were polished, hymnals aligned with military precision. A few candles flickered near the altar. The only other soul inside was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a black wool coat. Sleeves rolled to his elbows as he straightened hymn books. He turned at her footsteps. For a second, his face showed no recognition. Then his eyes widened. "Mara?" Her breath caught. "Jacob Rayner?" He stepped forward, disbelief written all over his face. "It really is you. You're still here?" "Deacon now, temporary preacher while they search for someone full-time." He gestured around. "No one wants to stay long. The church hasn't had a permanent pastor since—" He didn't finish. Mara nodded slowly. "Since the fire." Jacob studied her face for a moment. "You're here because of him." "I'm here because of Elise." That caught him off guard. "Elise?" "I found something," she said. "At the house, a cellar." His brow furrowed. "There was never a cellar." "There is, and in it, a dress. Her dress. And a message scratched into the wall." Jacob blinked. "That's not possible." "It's more than possible. It's there. Someone's been down there recently." He shook his head slowly. "Mara, if you're hoping—" "I'm not hoping," she interrupted. "I'm remembering. I'm listening." Jacob looked away, troubled. "You always believed me," she added quietly. "I did." "Then help me now." Later that day, Jacob drove her out to the old records office at the county annex, a place that smelled of mold and forgotten paper. They combed through archived blueprints, permits, and land records. "No mention of a basement," Jacob said, holding up the oldest blueprint he could find. Just a crawl space. Then someone built it without telling the county. Why? Mara stared at the faded blueprint. To hide something. That night, a note appeared outside her motel door. Folded, unsigned. Inside, 3 words. Look in the well. There was only one well on the old property, and no one but her family should have known it existed. It had been sealed before the fire. That's what Mara remembered. A heavy wooden lid nailed shut with a steel crossbeam. Her father had declared the old stone well too dangerous, even though it hadn't drawn water in years. The orchard beyond the house had been her mother's pride, rows of pear and apple trees lined like quiet guardians behind the property. She hadn't walked that stretch of land since the night the fire took everything. Until now. Morning sunlight filtered through bare branches as Mara stepped through the overgrown orchard, damp leaves sticking to her boots. The trees, once orderly, had grown wild in her absence, bent and bowed with age, branches clawing at the air like arthritic fingers. At the center of it all sat the old well. Its stones were weathered, moss-covered, but intact. The wooden lid had rotted through in places, exposing blackness beneath. No crossbeam remained. No nails. Someone had opened it. Mara knelt beside it, the envelope with the warning note clutched in her coat pocket. The message was clear. Look in the well. But how deep did it go? And who had sent her here? She took out her flashlight and clicked it on, angling the beam into the darkness. The light reached only part way. Stone walls descended in a circle. About 10 feet down, something caught the light, metal glinting faintly. A ladder. Not one from her childhood. This one was newer, bolted into the wall, coated in dust, but intact. This isn't just a well anymore, Mara realized. This was an entrance. She lowered herself carefully onto the ladder, feeling the cold metal sting her palms. Step by step, the world narrowed around her. The chill of the well settled into her skin. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed more stone. Not water, not silt. Just dry earth and a small arched doorway carved into the rock. An underground passage. Her father's sermons returned to her in fragments. There are places in this world where silence grows like mold, where truth stays buried because no one dares disturb it. She ducked through the narrow archway. The air inside was dry and cold. The passage curved slightly, lit only by her flashlight. After about 20 feet, the walls widened into a small room, no more than 10 by 10 feet. It wasn't empty. In the center sat a wooden chair. On it, a folded blanket, pale pink, like the one Elise had always carried with her to sleepovers. One corner was frayed, as if it had been rubbed between small fingers for comfort. Beside the chair was a metal lunchbox, the kind with cartoon animals on the side. Mara recognized it instantly. It had been Elise's favorite. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were crayons, faded, worn, and a notebook, its cover stained but intact. When she opened it, the pages were filled with drawings, childish at first, then more detailed. Houses, trees, a chapel, people with no faces, and then, on the last page, a single line of handwriting. He said if I stayed quiet, Mama would come back. Mara backed away from the chair, her breath catching. She felt as though the air itself had turned against her, pressing down, warning her to go no further. Her flashlight flickered. Then the sound. Software A scrape somewhere beyond the room. Metal against stone. Mara turned sharply, holding her breath. Nothing. Still, she backed toward the tunnel, fingers tight around the notebook. By the time she climbed the ladder and stood once again beneath the orchard's bare canopy, her heartbeat hadn't slowed. She drove straight to the chapel. The sanctuary was empty, save for Jacob, who was polishing the brass candle holders at the altar. He looked up as she burst in. I found the well, she said. Jacob dropped the cloth, expression hardening. You went down there? "There's a room," she said, breath still ragged. "There's a chair, a blanket, Elise's lunchbox. Someone's been keeping it, like a place for her." "For her," Jacob repeated. "She was down there, Jacob. I don't know when or how long, but that room, it's not abandoned. It's tended to." Jacob's face paled. "Are you sure?" She handed him the notebook. "Read the last page." He did. His fingers gripped the spine tightly. "Who is he?" she asked. Jacob looked up, voice low. "If I had to guess, it wasn't your father." Mara's chest tightened. "Then who?" Jacob hesitated, then said, "There was a man, a deacon. Left the church shortly after the fire. Said he had family back east. He was always quiet, obsessed with secrecy. His name was Elias Root." "That name's not in the reports," she said. "It wouldn't be," Jacob replied. "He disappeared before the ashes even cooled." That night, Mara returned to the inn to find a second note slid beneath her door. "Don't trust the church. Ask Bernice what she saw that night." She stared at the paper, the edges curled from damp. Whoever was leaving the notes wasn't guessing. They knew. She walked downstairs, her coat still on, and found Bernice in the kitchen, wiping down the counter. "May I ask you something?" Mara said. Bernice didn't look up. "I figured you might. What did you see the night of the fire?" Silence. Then Bernice set the cloth aside. "I saw someone leave the house before it burned, carrying something wrapped in a blanket." "Who?" Mara whispered. "I don't know," Bernice said. "But it wasn't your father." Bernice's kitchen was warm with the scent of cloves and wood polish, but the air between them felt brittle, fragile with memory. Mara stood still, barely breathing, as Bernice stared down at her folded hands. "You saw someone leave the house before the fire started?" Mara asked again, softer this time. Bernice nodded slowly. "It was late. I had trouble sleeping in those days. The whole hollow knew your father's sermons were stirring, but his silence off the pulpit was even louder. That night, something pulled me to the window, and I saw it plain as day. Or night, I suppose." "What did you see?" "A man, tall, wearing a coat with the collar turned up. He had something in his arms, wrapped in a blanket." Mara's pulse quickened. "Elise." "I thought so at the time," Bernice said quietly. "But I couldn't be sure. Whoever he was, he didn't go toward town. He crossed the orchard and vanished into the woods." "Did you tell anyone?" Bernice gave a bitter smile. "You think they would have listened to the widow who lived by the creek? I had already buried my own secrets. Speaking about someone else's didn't seem wise. But if that person took Elise, then someone lied to all of us," Bernice finished, "including you." The following morning was cold and gray, the clouds low enough to blur the treetops. Mara stood at the edge of the orchard, Jacob beside her, both staring at the well. "I brought gloves and rope," he said, lifting a duffel bag from the back of his truck. "If we're going back in, I'd rather not rely on a rusted ladder." "I want to search everything," Mara said. "The chair, the box, the floor. If there's something else hidden down there, anything, we have to find it." They worked silently, lowering themselves into the well once more. This time, with better light and supplies. The room felt less suffocating, though no less haunted. Mara moved to the chair. The blanket remained, unmoved. She picked it up gently and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Small threads of embroidery near the corner. A pattern of stars and a tiny letter E stitched in pink. "Elise's," she whispered. Jacob knelt at the base of the wall. "There's something behind this brick." He pried carefully with a flat tool, loosening one of the stones. Behind it was a small gap, and tucked inside, a tin box, the kind used for tea or coins. He opened it. Inside, a faded Polaroid photograph. A child, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the floor of a small room, Her eyes were wide, her clothes rumpled. In her arms, Charlotte, the doll. Mara dropped to her knees. "Elise," she breathed. The child's face was unmistakable. Jacob turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in pencil, "She cries too loud. We'll fix that soon." They climbed out of the well in silence, the tin box between them. Once back on solid ground, Mara sat on a mossy rock and stared at the photo again. "Elise was here," she murmured, "and someone kept her here." "But for how long?" Jacob asked. "And where did she go after?" Mara shook her head. "Someone wanted her hidden, maybe even thought they were helping her, but this—" She held up the photo. This was a warning. They returned to the chapel, hoping the old church records might contain something overlooked. Jacob unlocked the office, a room lined with ledgers, folders, and dust. "Start with the deacon logs," he suggested. Mara sat at the desk and opened the earliest book that covered 1995. Her eyes scanned entry after entry: baptisms, weddings, communion attendance. Then a name caught her eye: Elias Root. The handwriting was cramped but consistent. Elias had logged dozens of hours of volunteer work in the months leading up to the fire: groundskeeping, evening vigils, Sunday school prep. Then abruptly, his entries stopped. 3 days before the fire. Mara flipped ahead. Nothing. It was as if he vanished. "Jacob," she said, "how much do you really know about him?" "Only what people whispered, that he left quickly, didn't give a reason, no forwarding address." "What if he didn't leave?" she said. "What if he stayed and changed his name?" Jacob frowned. "To what?" "I don't know, but maybe someone else does." That evening, Mara drove to the edge of town, where the Hollow Pines care home stood at the end of a narrow lane. The building was modest, once a farmhouse, now retrofitted to serve the few elderly residents still in town. She signed in and asked for Evelyn Bartlow. "She's in the sunroom," the nurse said. "Good day for her. She might talk." Evelyn had been the church secretary during her father's ministry. Meticulous, loyal, and sharp-tongued. Now she sat in a wicker chair wrapped in a knitted shawl, her hair like frost. When Mara entered, Evelyn looked up. "Pastor Winslow's girl," she said, voice dry as a page. "You remember me?" "Course I do. I remember all the messes people leave behind." Mara sat beside her. "I need to ask you something, about Elias Root." Evelyn's face twitched slightly. "Him, tall man, quiet, wore shoes too clean for this town." "You knew him?" "I knew what I saw." "What did you see?" Evelyn stared out the window for a long moment, then said, "The night the house burned, he came to the chapel. He had a satchel with him. Looked like he'd seen a ghost." Mara leaned in. "What did he say?" "He asked me if the baptism records were secure. I told him yes. Then he told me, 'God sees everything, but the town doesn't need to.'" "What does that mean?" Evelyn turned to her, eyes sharp. "It means there's a second book." "A second what?" "Baptism log. Hidden one. Your father didn't know. Elias kept it in the back. Behind the hymnals." Mara stood up. "Do you think it's still there?" "Unless the rats have eaten it." That night, back in the chapel, Mara and Jacob returned to the dusty back room, where stacks of hymnals lined the shelves. Jacob pulled books down one by one until he paused. There, wedged behind the last row, was a cloth-bound ledger wrapped in an old church bulletin. Mara took it with trembling hands. Inside were 5 pages. Only one had writing. Name: Elise Winslow. Date of baptism: June 15th, 1996. Location: private ceremony, Crosslake Hollow. Officiant: E.R. Jacob's voice was hoarse. "Elise was baptized 2 years after the fire. And it wasn't my father who did it," Mara whispered. "It was Elias Root." She closed the book and stared at the candle-lit altar, her breath barely steady. Elise survived. The ledger sat between them on the chapel pew like a sleeping ghost. quiet, small, and heavy with implication. Mara stared at the single page bearing Elise's name, her mind refusing to settle. She whispered it again as if saying it aloud would make it real. Elise was alive after the fire. Jacob rubbed his jaw, eyes locked on the entry. Which means the story we've all been told was shaped. No remains, she said softly. No record of death. Just closure by assumption. And this, he tapped the ledger, was hidden from everyone. Mara turned the book over, studying its spine. It bore no title. Nothing to suggest it held something sacred or subversive. Just quiet ink, pressed by a hand that didn't want to be remembered. She looked up. Why would Elias keep her a secret, and why baptize her in hiding? Unless, Jacob said carefully, he wasn't planning to return her at all. They locked the book in the church safe before leaving, unsure who might be watching. Crosslake Hollow was small, but eyes could hide behind shutters and silence. The next morning, Mara made her way to the local library. The archive section, rarely used, held old newspapers and church newsletters bound by month. She pulled volumes from 1995 and 1996, thumbing through birth announcements, obituaries, town council minutes. But it wasn't until she reached August 1996 that she found something odd. A single sentence buried in the Crosslake Church bulletin under pastoral notes. We welcome into our care a new soul entrusted to us by grace and silence. May she be raised in the shelter of faith. No name, no family listed, just grace and silence. On her way out, she passed the bulletin board beside the front desk. Tacked among seasonal announcements was a missing persons leaflet, old and faded, likely posted for awareness rather than hope. But one face caught her eye. A girl, perhaps 11, with dark hair and distant eyes. The name printed beneath, Eva Robbins missing since 2005. Last seen near Lincoln County border. Answers to Ellie. Mara's hands went cold. The girl's face. It wasn't Elise, but it resembled the drawings in the notebook. The faceless figures, the chapel, the orchard. She copied the number listed on the flyer and tucked it in her coat. Back in the car, she stared at the photo, her thoughts spinning. Could Elias have given her a new name, a new identity? Eva, Ellie, Elise. Too close for coincidence. Later that afternoon, Mara sat with Bernice again in the parlor. The flyer laid across the table. Do you recognize her? Mara asked. Bernice adjusted her glasses, studying the image. I do, she said softly. She used to sit in the back row of the chapel. Quiet child. Barely spoke. People said she was adopted by one of the retired deacons who lived near the edge of town. Elijah Root. Bernice blinked. He went by a different name by then. Edward Ramsey. Lived on Cedar Bend in that old farmhouse with the barn full of broken pews. Is he still alive? He passed a few years ago. No funeral. Just a sealed box sent to the county morgue. Mara swallowed hard. And the girl? No one saw her after that. That evening, Mara and Jacob drove to Cedar Bend. The farmhouse sat crouched between leafless trees, its windows dark, shutters nailed shut. It looked less abandoned than sealed, like it had been locked against more than weather. They parked at the edge of the property and crossed the overgrown lawn. Jacob pushed open the barn first. Dust plumed from the door like breath. Inside were pews stacked like driftwood, broken hymnals, and a cracked baptismal basin turned upside down. Mara wandered toward the house. The front door was bolted, so they circled to the back. A cellar door, rusted but unlocked, yawned open at the earth. They descended. The air in the basement was stale but dry. A row of bookshelves lined the far wall, religious texts, journals, newspaper clippings pinned to corkboard. Yellowed, curling. Then Mara saw the bed. A small one, iron-framed, child-sized. The blanket was pink. The pillow had embroidered stars. She reached out and touched it, her fingers trembling. "She lived here," she whispered. Jacob was flipping through one of the journals. "Listen to this. March 1997. She sleeps quietly now, sings to herself when no one listens, calls the doll Mother. I think she's starting to forget the fire." Mara's throat tightened. "She was a child," she said, "and he kept her in this place like a shadow." They found more notebooks, sketches, hymns rewritten in a child's hand, and on the back of one page, scrawled in charcoal, she said, "My name isn't Elise anymore, but I remember. I remember before I was erased." That night, back at the inn, Mara sat with everything spread before her. The photo, the baptism ledger, the sketchbook, the leaflet. Elias, Edward, had kept Elise hidden, renamed her, raised her in a false silence. And when he died, she vanished again. But someone else knew. Someone had sent the first envelope. Someone wanted Mara to follow this trail. Near midnight, a knock came at the door. 3 soft taps. She opened it slowly. An envelope lay on the floor. Inside, only one sentence. "She's still in Crosslake Hollow." The next morning, fog draped Crosslake Hollow in a pale shroud. The streets were silent, the chapel bell dormant. Mara sat on the edge of her bed at the inn, the envelope resting in her hands. She's still in Crosslake Hollow. Not was, not buried. Still. She stared out the window toward the steeple visible through bare-limbed trees. Every memory she had of the chapel was laced with firelight and grief. But now the place pulled at her like a thread she could no longer ignore. Jacob met her on the chapel steps just after dawn. He carried a thermos of coffee and eyes that hadn't slept much. "I read through more of the journal," he said. "Edward, Elias, wrote about a safe room in the chapel. He built it himself after the fire, said it was meant as sanctuary for the soul not ready for the world." Mara's hands clenched. A hiding place? Maybe more than that. They stepped inside. The sanctuary was dim and cold, candles extinguished, the hush of empty pews pressing in around them. Where would he build something like that? She asked. Jacob looked up. The loft. The choir loft had always felt like a secret balcony to Mara when she was young. Her father let her sit up there during evening services, close enough to the organ to feel its vibrations through the floorboards. She hadn't climbed those steps in 2 decades. Dust floated in the light as they ascended. At the top, old choir robes hung on hooks like sleeping ghosts. Behind the robes, bare wall. But Jacob ran his hand along the wood paneling, knocked, paused. He pressed a corner. A click. A panel slid open. Behind it, a narrow passage leading to a small attic space walled in by thick timber and soundproofing foam. There was a cot in one corner, a lamp, a stack of books, and a folded note resting atop a Bible. Mara picked it up, her name printed carefully on the front. Inside, in neat handwriting, "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I remember you. I never forgot. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder, but I'm here, and I want you to find me." It was signed E. Jacob sat beside her as she clutched the letter. "She was here," Mara said. "Recently. That dust on the floor, it's not settled. Someone's been sleeping here." Jacob nodded. "And leaving the notes. But why not reveal herself? Maybe she doesn't trust what she remembers. Or maybe she's waiting for the truth to be ready." Mara turned to the small shelf beside the cot. It held only 3 books, a hymn book, a tattered novel, and a red binder with no label. She opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them, clipped from newspapers, printed from online stories, hand-drawn. Girls, missing ones. Names scrawled beneath each, counties, dates, faces of all ages. One page had a title written across the top, The Others. She wasn't the only one. Mara whispered. He kept others. Back at the inn, Mara spread the binder's contents across the bed. Bernice entered with fresh towels and stopped cold. "What is all that?" she asked. "Proof," Mara said, "of what Elias Root was doing." Bernice's face went pale. I knew he was strange, but he didn't just take Elise. He took other girls, hid them, renamed them, raised them in silence. Bernice looked down at the binder. One photo caught her eye. Her lips trembled. "I know this girl." Mara looked up sharply. "What?" "She came through the clinic, maybe 10 years ago. Had a fever, wouldn't speak. We called child services, but no one ever followed up. The nurse said she vanished from the shelter a week later." "Where?" "Town records might have the address. I'll make a call." That afternoon, Mara and Jacob followed Bernice's directions to an old cottage near the northern ridge. The shutters were closed. The garden was overgrown. But there were signs of life. Faint smoke from the chimney, a bucket of rainwater beside the door. They knocked. No answer. Jacob stepped back. "We should wait. Maybe she's not—" Then the door creaked open. A girl stood there. No, not a girl, a young woman, 19, maybe 20, pale skin, dark hair pulled back, her eyes wide, uncertain, and unmistakably familiar. Mara froze. "Elise?" The girl's lips parted, but no sound came. Then, barely above a whisper, "Do you remember the doll?" "Charlotte." Mara's knees nearly buckled. "Elise," she whispered. "It's you." The girl nodded slowly. "They told me." "You forgot." "I never did," Mara said, tears in her eyes. "I never stopped wondering." They stepped inside. The house was sparse. One room, a wood stove, simple furnishings, the kind of place built for hiding. "I found the cellar," Mara said gently. "I found your drawings." Elise sat slowly at the edge of the cot. Her hands trembled. "I thought I was someone else," she whispered. "He told me I was, that the fire had taken everything. He said, if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe, that God only heard the silent ones." Mara knelt before her. "You were a child. None of this was your fault." "I wanted to come back," Elise said, "but I didn't know how." "You just did." That night back at the chapel, Jacob stood at the pulpit. The pews were empty, but the candlelight cast a warm glow. "Elise is alive," he said quietly. Bernice, seated in the front row, crossed herself. "Thank God." Mara placed the binder on the altar. "There are others," she said. "We don't know where they are, but we know how to look now, what to look for." Elise stood beside her, silent but no longer unseen. The wind swept through Crosslake Hollow like a long sigh that night, as if the trees themselves had been waiting to exhale. Mara sat beside the fireplace at the inn. Elise curled beneath a quilt, her face turned to the flames. Neither spoke for a while. Some silences were sacred, others were learned. When Elise finally did speak, it was in fragments. Not all of it made sense, and some of it never would, but it was enough. "He never hurt me," she said softly. "Not the way people think." Mara nodded slowly. "You don't have to explain." "I still want to." She turned her eyes toward the fire. "He said I'd been spared, that the fire was meant for someone else. He said your prayers had saved me, but that I wasn't to tell anyone." Mara's voice cracked. "He took you." "Yes, but he believed he was rescuing me." "From what? I don't know. From the world? From sin? From you?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I believed him for a long time. You were a child. I stopped counting the days. He gave me new names, Ellie, Ava, Grace. Said God didn't need me to have just one." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "It took years to remember I had a real one. Elise." The name hung in the air like a ribbon, soft and real. "I remembered Charlotte first," Elise said. Then the orchard. Then Mama's laugh. Mara leaned forward. You said once, the fire was meant for someone else. Did you mean? Elise hesitated. He told me your father was the target, that the church wanted to silence him, but later he said something different, that it was meant for me. Mara stared. For you? Elise nodded. I don't think he was well, Mara. He was kind some days, and other days, he would cry in the dark, pray for hours, talk to people who weren't there. Mara felt her breath catch. And yet, he kept you. I think he thought he was saving me, but I was a secret he couldn't carry forever. The next day, Jacob contacted a retired county investigator, Alan Hart, one of the few lawmen from that era still living. He agreed to meet them at the chapel. Hart was a tall man in his 70s, gray hair slicked back, voice like gravel. I remember the Winslow fire, he said. Nothing about it sat right. Reports were incomplete. The autopsy on your father was inconclusive, burn patterns inconsistent with the fire's origin point. Why didn't you say anything back then? Mara asked. Chain of command, he muttered. And pressure from the top. The church wanted it quiet, and someone made sure it stayed that way. Jacob stepped forward. We think Deacon Elias Root. He later went by Edward Ramsey. Had something to do with Elise's disappearance. Hart's eyes narrowed. That name I remember. Quiet type, but odd. Always seemed to be around the chapel late at night. I'll dig. He wasn't just a deacon. He was tied to something bigger. What do you mean? Hart shrugged. I mean, I'll make some calls, but be careful. Folks who keep secrets this long usually have help keeping them. That night, Mara returned to the orchard with Elise. The well stood like a scar in the earth, its stones slick with moss. I want to see it, Elise said quietly. One last time. Mara hesitated, then nodded. She held the rope as Elise descended slowly, her steps sure despite the years. When she reached the bottom, Mara watched her kneel beside the chair, the blanket, the books, still untouched. When she returned, her cheeks were damp. I thought it was a hiding place, she said. But it was a cage. You don't have to go back there again, Mara said. I did. To close it, in my heart. A week passed. Elise remained in Crosslake Hollow, living in the parsonage guest room. She began attending quiet morning services. She didn't speak to the other townsfolk. Most didn't know what to say, but she sang. She sang with a voice that filled the empty chapel like sunlight through stained glass. Then one morning, Bernice came to Mara with a parcel. This came to the inn, no return address. Mara opened it carefully. Inside, a photograph. A group of children, perhaps 6 or 7, standing beside a small chapel, their faces blurred. One of them, a girl with dark braids, looked strikingly like Elise. Tucked behind it, a page from a ledger. Elise Winslow, date of transfer May 1996. New ward, St. Therese Shelter, under clerical directive. Signed, Bishop A.R. Camden. Mara turned it over. One line written in ink. It was never about saving her. It was about silencing the bloodline. Her stomach turned. Bloodline, she whispered. Jacob read over her shoulder. Mara, what if this wasn't just Elias? What if this goes deeper? They returned to the county archives. Among sealed boxes and dusty microfilm reels, they found fragments. A report about unsanctioned shelter operations in the late 90s, a complaint dismissed by diocesan authority, and one article almost buried. 3 children relocated after closure of St. Therese facility, record sealed under State Confidentiality Act. One of the children, unnamed. But the attached photo showed Elise. She hadn't just been taken. She had been moved, protected, hidden, by design, by someone with power. Elise, Mara said that evening. Did he ever say why he picked you? Elise was silent for a moment. Then, he said I had the gift. That my father's voice was too loud, that our family remembered too much, that people like us had to disappear so others could keep pretending. Mara gripped her hand. "You're not going to disappear again." "I'm not," Elise said. "I'm going to sing louder." The next morning, Mara placed the binder of missing girls on the county clerk's desk. "I want an inquiry opened," she said. The clerk paled. "Do you have legal representation? Number one, have truth. And a voice that remembers." Word traveled slowly in Crosslake Hollow, but it traveled. Within days of Mara submitting the binder and records to the county office, strange things began to happen. The chapel's mailbox was torn open one morning. Its contents burned. A stranger in a dark sedan was seen parked outside the inn, engine running, then gone before sunrise. And on the third night, someone broke into the old records office. Nothing stolen, just one drawer open, the one containing baptism logs and transfer letters from the late 90s. "They know we're looking," Jacob said, running his fingers over the broken lock. "And they're looking back." Mara folded her arms. "Let them." But Elise was quieter than usual. She stared out the window that night, Charlotte the doll cradled in her arms, the firelight playing on her face. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I think the fire never really stopped. It just found other ways to burn." Mara sat beside her. "It won't touch you again. Not while I'm here." The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Alan Hart, the retired investigator, returned. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman in a brown coat with federal credentials stood beside him. Agent Laureen Shaw, part of a cold case division quietly reopened just months prior. "We've been tracking similar patterns," she told Mara, laying out files across the chapel pews. Children rehomed through unofficial channels, no legal guardianship, faith-based shelters used as fronts. She tapped Elise's name. "Your sister isn't alone, and you may have just blown the case wide open." That afternoon, Elise brought out the last journal from the binder. "I didn't understand this entry before," she said, pointing to the back cover. "But now I do." Written in delicate script, I left them behind. 3 voices, trained to sing but never heard. Crosslake holds more than just the 2 of us. Mara's eyes widened. 3. "Elise," Jacob said, "are you saying there were more girls kept here?" Elise nodded slowly. "I heard them. We weren't allowed to speak during the day, but at night, they sang through the walls. I never saw their faces, but I remember the harmony." "Do you remember their names?" Mara asked. Elise hesitated, then said, "Naomi, Claire, and Lily." They searched parish records, school rosters, and shelter logs. Nothing official. But in the back of an unused Sunday school supply cabinet, Mara found a roll of class photos, one from spring 1998. In the bottom row, Elise. Beside her, 3 unnamed girls. Their eyes said everything their missing records didn't. By week's end, Agent Shaw's investigation widened. County subpoenas were issued. Boxes sealed decades ago were ordered reopened. But something else arrived first. A letter, typed, no return address. "You're digging into stories meant to be sermons. Let them lie, or more than names will be buried." Elise didn't flinch. Mara didn't hesitate. "We press on," she said. That Sunday, for the first time in 20 years, Elise stepped into the choir loft again, not to hide, but to sing. The chapel was half full. Word had spread quietly. Mothers, grandparents, former parishioners. A few new faces drawn by the whispers of a survivor with a song to share. Elise stood alone beneath the stained glass and sang a hymn her mother had taught her before the fire. Soft at first, then stronger, a voice that once had to hide, now echoing freely through every timber and pew. Afterward, as candles flickered and the air settled again, an elderly woman approached the pulpit, tears in her eyes. She held a photograph. "This girl," she whispered. "This was my granddaughter, Naomi. She vanished in 1999. We were told she was sent to a mission school, but no one ever answered our letters." Mara held the photo. It matched one of the unnamed girls in the class roll. "You found her," the woman wept. "You found the truth." Back at the inn, Elise sat at the desk, sketching again. This time, it wasn't figures without faces. It was 3 girls standing in the orchard, their hands linked, their faces clear. That evening, Bernice gave Mara a small black box. "I kept this for years," she said. "Didn't know why. Just knew it wasn't mine to throw away." Inside, an audio cassette, labeled in faded ink. Chapel Choir, June 1996. Private recording. They played it on an old deck borrowed from the church basement. Static. Then, 4 voices, children's, fragile, harmonizing. And a 5th voice, older, male, whispering beneath the melody. "The ones who remain silent shall be lifted. The ones who remember must forget." Mara's hand clenched around the armrest. "They were training them," she said. "Not just hiding them, preparing them." The fire in 1996 didn't just erase a family. It buried a choir, a doctrine, and the truth Elise had carried in silence for 2 decades. Now the flames were fading, and the voices were returning. The recording played again in the chapel that night, this time for Agent Shaw and Investigator Hart. The cassette's warbled hymn echoed through the sanctuary, its harmonies haunted, the whispered voice underneath chilling in its precision. When the music faded, silence lingered like smoke after a candle's death. Mara broke it. Whoever recorded this, they weren't just preserving a moment. They were documenting obedience. Agent Shaw nodded. And indoctrination. Children taught to sing, but not to speak. The following morning, Agent Shaw handed Mara a sealed envelope. "It came from Diocesan Archives in Seattle. You have contacts." Mara opened it carefully. Inside was a scanned document, old, crinkled at the edges. Crosslake Hollow, transfer record. June 1996. Child, Elise Winslow. Status, deferred transfer. Authorized by Bishop A.R. Camden. Notes, retain under Deacon Elias Root until deemed ready for external placement. And beneath it, child, Naomi Brooks, placed. Child, Claire Henley, placed. Child, Lily Ashcroft, status unknown. The 5th remains undocumented. Mara's blood ran cold. "The 5th?" Shaw leaned over. "Elise mentioned 3 others, but this says 5. One of them, never officially recorded." Jacob, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. "What if that's the girl we don't have a name for? The one Elise only ever called the hushed one in her drawings?" Mara nodded slowly. "The one who never sang." They returned to the orchard well. This time, not to revisit, but to search. Elise came too, quiet but strong. With gloves and lanterns, they descended and searched every crevice of the underground room. Elise paced the floor, trailing her hand along the stone walls, pausing at a faint crack near the back. Jacob noticed it too. "This isn't just settling, it's a seam." He pulled away a layer of crumbling mortar. Behind it, a metal compartment embedded in the stone, rusted shut. They pried it open carefully. Inside was a leather-bound book, swollen with time, its pages yellowed and soft. The cover read only, "Choir Candidates." They brought it to the chapel to examine under safer light. Inside, names, dozens, children, listed by first name only. Ages, dates, vague phrases under notes, strong voice, needs discipline, for later placement. Some names were marked with stars. Others were crossed out entirely, and at the very back, an entry written in different handwriting. "The 5th girl. Not to be named, no record, too quiet. But she listens, always." Under it, the page was smudged as if by tears or rain. Below the smear, 2 words had been scribbled hastily. Basement ledger. I never heard of a basement ledger, Jacob said, frowning. The main ones were kept in the office. Bernice looked up from the altar where she'd been arranging candles. There's a storage crawl space beneath the chapel. Mara turned. You've seen it? Once, years ago. A trap door beneath the sacristy. I thought it was for old choir robes. They searched that afternoon. The sacristy was dim, the floorboards warped with time. But beneath the woven rug, they found the hatch. Wooden, square, with rusted hinges. Jacob opened it. The crawl space below was dry and cramped, lit only by their flashlights. There, in the corner, wrapped in oilskin, a long, narrow box. Inside, ledger books, 11 of them, carefully labeled by year. Mara flipped through the one marked 1996. Each page listed names, sermon rosters, choir practices, private confession appointments. But in the back, a different set of entries, code names, and a phrase repeated every few pages. Silence is sanctuary. Obedience is salvation. Then, between pages, a photograph. A girl in a white choir robe, standing alone in the loft. Her face was turned slightly, her expression blank. Mara turned it over. The 5th girl. No name, no voice. Still watching. Elise stared at it, her voice barely audible. That's her. Mara looked up. Do you know where she went? Number, but I think she never left. That night, Elise stood alone in the chapel and lit a single candle. She listened, she whispered. So I will sing for her now. Mara watched from the pews as Elise sang again, the hymn echoing like a memory that finally had permission to return. Later, Jacob brought in a priest, Father Merrill, from a neighboring county. He examined the ledgers, the binder, the cassette. Then he looked at Elise. What they did was not of God, he said gently. It was of fear. You survived something that tried to rewrite you, but you were never erased. Elise asked quietly, and the others? We'll find them, he promised, or we'll leave no corner of this country unsearched. That evening, a final envelope arrived at the inn. It bore no name, no stamp. Inside was only one item, a silver cross pendant, worn and bent, and a note, return her voice. The silence was never hers to carry. A soft snow had begun to fall over Crosslake Hollow. The white dust clung to rooftops and bare branches, making the entire town look untouched. Innocent, almost. But Mara knew better. Underneath that stillness, the earth remembered. So did the voices. In the chapel, Elise stood in front of the altar again. Not as a ghost of the past, not as a name scribbled in a forgotten ledger, but as herself. She wore a simple choir robe, one Bernice had lovingly cleaned and repaired. Around her neck hung the silver cross from the anonymous envelope. Its edges were still bent, but Elise said she didn't want it fixed. I want it to look like what it survived, she whispered. The church was full that evening. For the first time in decades, every pew held someone. Neighbors who once feared the truth now came to listen to it. Families who had lost daughters came holding old photographs, unsure what they'd find but unwilling to stay away. Federal agents, retired clergy, reporters with notepads, and Mara at the front, beside Elise, her hand resting lightly on her sister's shoulder. Elise stepped forward to the pulpit. She didn't use notes. I was once taught that silence was holy, she began, her voice calm but steady. That speaking would ruin what was sacred, that if I made noise, I would disappear. She paused. Not one person in the room moved, but I was never the one who needed to disappear. Her eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on the front row, where Naomi's grandmother sat clutching the class photo in both hands. There were others. Naomi, Claire, Lily, and a 5th girl whose name I never knew. But we shared something, She placed the silver cross gently on the altar. We were all told to sing for the wrong reasons. Not to worship, not to praise, but to prove obedience. Mara felt her eyes sting with tears. Today, I sing because I'm free. She stepped back, and then she sang. The same hymn she had sung in hiding. The one her mother used to hum while folding laundry. The one Elise had taught to herself in pieces, note by note, in the cellar beneath a chapel that forgot it had once loved her. When the final note fell silent, not a single person clapped. They simply stood. A quiet reverence, a shared grief, a communal recognition of what had been taken and what had finally returned. Afterward, people lined up to speak with Elise. Some gave names of girls they once knew. Some shared photos, unsure if they meant anything. Some just wept. One woman handed Mara a folded note. My niece vanished in 2003. The choir photo from your binder. She's in it. I never thought anyone would care enough to find her. Thank you, Agent Shaw approached with a folder of updates. The fifth girl, she said, may have gone by the name Rachel Whitlow in one of the shelter systems. We're verifying now. She paused. And your father, he didn't die in vain. Mara looked at her. How do you mean? Shaw opened the folder. Inside were copies of letters Father Winslow had sent to diocesan offices weeks before the fire. He'd written warnings. He had seen what Elias Root was doing, and he'd tried to stop it. Mara's breath caught. He knew. He tried, Shaw said, and someone made sure he couldn't try again. They never found Elias's grave. No headstone, no marker. But Mara knew now that his legacy hadn't been silence. It had been exposure. His own madness had revealed a system built on secrecy, and Elise had broken it open. The investigation stretched on for months. Stories emerged from nearby towns. Church records long sealed were subpoenaed and opened. A few names reappeared. Some children found, others never would be. But the ledger was no longer closed. The voices were no longer hidden. 6 months later. The chapel stood quiet in early spring, wildflowers growing along the orchard's edge. The well had been sealed, but not forgotten, marked now with a plaque, in memory of those who were silenced. Let no voice be buried again. Inside, Elise sat in the choir loft, singing softly as children from the new parish school learned their parts. Some sang in tune, some didn't. One boy dropped his music sheet. Everyone laughed, and Elise smiled. Mara stood in the back, watching, her fingers brushing over a leather-bound book. A new ledger, not of silence, but of names, of the found. Outside, as bells rang for evening mass, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed to the photo wall. "Who's that one?" she asked. Her mother knelt beside her, reading the plaque beneath the photograph of 4 girls and 1 blank space. "She's the one we still sing for," she said. "The one who listened." The truth was buried for decades, until she uncovered it. If you believe every missing voice deserves to be heard, please like, share, and subscribe, because some stories were never meant to stay silent.